department stores, private houses. But most of his clients were Jewish. He was Jewish. And in January 1933, Hitler came to power. And he was advised, apparently by Chimaev, who wrote to him, he was advised to leave Germany. And he, I believe from his daughter, they just packed a bag and went.
Many of the residents of Bexhill gawped and complained as the strange steel skeleton appeared. Mendelssohn had used this technology before, but to the British, it was completely new.
Other architects were incredibly upset that the pair had won. In letters to the Architects' Journal that would be regarded as racist today, they attacked the design by what they called these aliens.
I think that's partly to do with Englishness, not xenophobia, but this reticence to have other people come in. But I think it's also partly to do with trying to keep away modernism, which I think was seen as a sort of left-wing socialist enemy almost coming into the country.
Nothing was too good for the ordinary person.
And that's at the root of modernism. This idea that this building is a socialist or social, perhaps, building, that it's for everybody.
The new pavilion was a real people's palace. It boasted a theatre for 1,500, a light and spacious restaurant, a library and reading rooms surrounded by elegant terraces and balconies.
Mendelssohn and Chimaev produced the first major welded steel frame building in Britain. The steel frame is exactly as it was, high above the auditorium. De La Ware wanted a building of the modern movement, and that is what he got. Did Mendelssohn put a lot of thought into how the services were going to be delivered?
I think he did, yes. And you can see that when you look at the building. These supporting columns here actually have the drain pipes running through, so that when you look at the building, there's no clutter on the outside of the building. There's no guttering, no downpipes that you can see. And that's true of the whole building inside and out. Everything is pure forms, light coming in, windows, thin membrane, like a skin, like a membrane around this steel frame.
By the 1930s, Siam's membership had doubled, but Europe was in turmoil. The Nazis reviled the modern movement as a force for internationalism and communism. In 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor, Siam convened on a boat in the Mediterranean to plan the future. Led by Corbusier, they studied plans of 34 of the world's major cities and produced the Athens Charter, an idealistic blueprint for a new form of city. Among the architects on board was Wells Coates, a British-based Canadian. He was a founder member of the British wing of Siam, and spurred on by the steady stream of émigré architects fleeing the Nazis, he helped the modernist movement in this country take shape. Just 1 year later, in 1934, Wells Coates completed the first project for communal modernist living in Britain. Built in the London suburb of Hampstead, the Lawn Road flats were commissioned by a design firm called Isokon. Isocon's owners, Jack and Molly Pritchard, were fascinated by modernist ideals and formed their company to promote them. Lawn Road's fully serviced flats were fitted with furniture designed by the Pritchards and Wells Coates, much of it made from the new wonder material, plywood. By the late 20th century, the building had fallen on hard times, but when they were built, the 32 apartments were hugely appealing to tenants who wanted to live a new, dynamic, clutter-free life.
The sales pitch for the Lawn Road flats was that they would provide living places which would not be obsolete in 1950. Tenants could move in here with a minimum of possession. Your every need was catered for. There was furniture, fridges, cookers, and a minimum of services, including constant hot water, central heating, bed making, dusting, cleaning, and even shoe polishing. This was modern living.
On the ground floor there was a restaurant, the Isobar, where tenants could dine or telephone to order meals to be sent up to their apartment. Wells Coates topped the building with a penthouse for Jack and Molly Pritchard and their 2 young sons, Jeremy and Jonathan.
God. Block wallpaper.
Yes,
All
terrible.
And of course, all the walls were plywood. Yeah?
Now, they were certainly on, whether they were on both sides plywood, I don't think they were.
God, it's all there, isn't it?
And the floor, of course, was and still is plywood. So it's still in quite good condition.
Yeah. Does it bring back memories?
It certainly does.
The Pritchards were, as it were, the mentors of all these architects, in a sense, weren't they?
In many ways, yes. I mean, Jack and Molly got to know Wells Coates early on, and they were already very interested in modern architecture and how architecture was developing.
The block was an astonishing sight amid the rows of Victorian semis. Here Wells Coates demonstrated that the future should be planned rather than just patching up the past. He utterly embraced Corbusier's idea that a house should be a machine for living in. Not just a flat, not quite an hotel, something entirely new.
Was Corbusier an abiding influence on your father?
Very much, from the beginning, and he admired him enormously. And I think they shared a kind of rationality which went a long way to cementing their friendship. They both believed in the power of reason to solve their architectural problems. But they both enjoyed a bit of fun also. They used to exchange tokens. One would do a little drawing and another would do a little poem.
The apartments attracted an extraordinary array of tenants. Other architects, Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer, lived here, as did the sculptor Henry Moore and the novelist Agatha Christie. This was the place to live in London. This is all as was. Look.
Yeah, this is very much as it was.
Oh, God, you think about the original lock. Oh, look at that.
This would have been my father's wardrobe. He was very keen on plywood, and you see he's arranged the shelf to come in and out to get at his...
So even to save him the effort of going in and finding things.
Yeah.
And then bathroom, bit of a mess. Original sink.
Yeah.
And the kitchen. It strikes me the kitchens were small.
Yeah, and of course this is a big kitchen compared with most of the flats. The cooker would have been over there.
And the dumb waiter.
And the dumb waiter, yes, that's where we got our breakfast up from.
If you think of a lot of the building that was done then, imitation, nothing but imitation. And it's the same today, of course, not much has changed. So that was one aspect, and the other was the social aspect, to build really for people's needs, to try to take into account everyone, whether they were poor or middle class or rich.
These flats, of course, the Lawn Road flats, were not for poor people.
They weren't for rich people, no.
Were they for intellectuals?
No, they were for people who wanted a really decent, small home to live in.
The Lawn Road flats put the modern movement's housing ideas on the map. Less than a year later, an even more impressive modernist housing project was unveiled. High Point 1 is a block of 60 flats built on London's highest hill in Highgate. The architect was yet another émigré, Berthold Lubetkin, a Georgian who'd grown up in Russia before moving to England to establish a modernist architectural practice called Tecton. Lubetkin had met Corbusier in Paris and was inspired, especially by the Villa Savoie. The apartments were much more spacious than those at Lawn Road, but like Lawn Road, full of innovation. And Lubetkin tried to establish a similar sense of community by creating huge public hallways, and there was even a tea room. But his attempt to give High Point a social life failed, much to his disappointment. The flats were almost too self-contained and well-appointed for bohemian life.
While the internal public spaces didn't really work, the outside was spectacular. Landscape gardens, tennis courts, even a swimming pool, all the things that Lawn Road lacked. When Le Corbusier visited here, he paid Lubetkin the ultimate compliment. He said that his ideas for urban development, vertical garden cities, had been realised here at High Point, in these 60 flats.
flats were snapped up by the middle classes, and high above London, this brilliant white building became a beacon for modernism. But for Lebetkin, the political upheaval of the Russian Revolution and his knowledge of Soviet communal living had given him a significantly different perspective. He wanted to build homes like these for the working classes. In every city in Britain, hundreds of thousands of men, women and children were crammed into vast areas of slum housing. Whole families would live, sleep and eat in a single room, sharing makeshift kitchens on the landing with other families living on the same floor. There were often no inside lavatories. Every drop of water had to be hauled up many flights of stairs. Disease was rife and conditions dreadful. The worst of the housing was on the brink of collapse. There was a desperate need for new and better homes.
Modernism in Britain was never going to take off if architects stuck to elitist schemes for the middle classes. There was a big idea to transform the cities and build quality housing for the working classes. That was the unique selling point. And this was the very first example, Kensal House, the first modernist public housing scheme.
In 1933, the Labour government passed an act offering local authorities a subsidy for every person they rehoused out of the slums. But these local authorities were reluctant to employ modernist solutions. It was benevolent capitalism that gave modernists their chance. The breakthrough came at Kensal House, and its chief architect was Maxwell Fry, a British modernist and a member of Siam.
The Gas, Light and Coke Company decided to build a block of working class flats. These flats, incidentally a valuable contribution to rehousing, were to show that gas can bring to the tenants of such schemes comforts and conveniences that might be thought to be out of their reach. Kensal House, as it is called, is built in 2 blocks running north and south.
I moved here 20 years ago and it was nothing like it was now.
What was it like?
When I first moved here, I remember walking up Ladbroke Grove thinking, I hope it's not that dirty green building at the top, because it was painted green, it was camouflage green.
The whole thing?
The whole thing was painted green. It was originally a light colour white, but during the war they had to paint it, otherwise it would have been an easy target for night bombers.
Kensal House marks the moment when the social and political ideals of the British modern movement came together. The 2- and 3-bedroom flats were luxurious compared to the slums. There was a bathroom, a kitchen and 2 balconies, a so-called garden balcony and a drying balcony for laundry.
It sort of doesn't feel like a building that you would see next to a railway line off Ladbroke Grove in London.
No, much more appropriate for somewhere on the Mediterranean in the south of France or somewhere like that with the sea lapping up here.
But is it quite an uplifting feeling being here?
I think so, yeah. Yes, it is. The flats are bright and they're airy. I mean, they've been designed really well because in the morning you get the sun coming through in the bedrooms and in the afternoon, of course, you've got the sun coming through in your living room and kitchen.
In 1937, modernism was still not widely embraced. Even the Royal Institute of British Architects was against it, so it's not surprising the local authority didn't pay for Kensal House. But for the Gas, Light and Coke Company, this was a showcase.
Gas and Coke Company?
Gas, Light and Coke Company, yeah.
Could believe that they could create almost a perfect environment for people.
Yes, that was the idea, yeah. Modern living using gas, light and coke. And I think it's important that gas light, because every flat was lit by gas and not by electricity.
What about heating?
All the heating was gas, apart from a coke fire in the main room.
But this wasn't just a block of flats. Everything the community might need was provided.
The idea that there was a communal place to eat, a communal place to work, a communal place to discuss things.
Yep, that's part. That was built into the. That was.
It must have seemed revolutionary in the 30s.
Oh, it was. Yeah, there wasn't any. The whole idea was that it was going to be a self-sufficient, self-supplying community with everything that you needed here. So there were community rooms along the bottom and underneath here. So and they used to do activities like shoe repairs, cobbling shops. There was I think there used to be metalwork classes, woodwork classes. I think there might have been a gardening club as well and a sewing club. So everything was here.
But the most important part of the social package was a nursery. Not only was this invaluable for the Kensal House mothers, but it also meant that the children could learn new lessons in hygiene and be seen regularly by a nurse.
It's like a pavilion that's child-sized.
Yes, it is. That's exactly what it is. So, you know, they could leave children in pushchairs and things. One of the things that is special about this place, it's a small, contained estate. You know, I've got very strong ties to it, I think. And I feel very passionate about the building as well.
I'd never guessed.
No.
The modernist ideals were still alien to many who were responsible for the well-being of thousands in the slums. But one London borough was different.
In the 1930s, Finsbury was one of the poorest and unhealthiest boroughs in the country. Socialist councillors in what was often described as the People's Republic of Finsbury drew up the Finsbury Plan for public libraries, swimming pools, a market, day nurseries and a health centre. In the end, the only thing that was built was the health centre, but it was revolutionary. Tecton, led by Berthold Lubetkin, were perfect architects for the job. They'd already produced plans for an ideal health centre as early as 1932, plans that had been seen by a Finsbury doctor. According to Lubetkin, nothing was too good for ordinary people.
The centre was desperately needed to tackle diseases like TB, probably the biggest killer. The smog deprived the population of sunlight and caused rickets in children, and homes were ridden with fleas and lice. Finsbury Health Centre opened in 1938, 10 years before the NHS was created. There was nothing like it anywhere in the country.
It must have seemed so alien in this area.
Well, I imagined for people who lived here, and you have to imagine that it was a sort of sooty, blackened, rat-infested, overcrowded inner London borough with high levels of deprivation. When this thing arrived, you know, clean, cream, gleaming, it was like a sort of flying saucer, you know, delivering healthcare to the local population.
Everything was very carefully planned. The offices were upstairs, the treatment rooms were all easily accessible on the ground floor. There was a TB clinic, a dentist surgery, a clinic for women, even a solarium and a chiropodist.
It was the idea of an open terrace to promote health and vitality, yet that the smog and the soot must have been dreadful around here.
Well, it was. I mean, I think the idea was that it was going to get better, and therefore one should encourage the idea of outdoor activity. So it was an important part of the overall proposition.
You knew Lubetkin well in his later years. What sort of a man was he?
He was a very complex man. I mean, he had this very rich background. He'd come out of Russia in the early 1920s and had been a witness to some of the ferment after the revolution. And he had a very clear idea of art's social purpose from that experience. And he was a highly cultured man, very serious, but also very funny.
Well, I must say, I didn't expect to be here at 50 years after. Ooh.
You mean you wouldn't expect you to be here or the building to be here?
Both.
It's astonishingly, stuff survives here. And these chairs are his.
Yeah, there's some original furniture here. Some tables are still here. The original light fittings on the wall there are highly characteristic, and you see them in High Point 2, for example. But many other things have changed. They intended to have no reception desk at all. It was to feel like a club where anyone could stroll in, you could sit down, read a paper, you didn't need to have an appointment, and then eventually a nurse might come along and say, hello, can I help you in any way? And you'd sort of be absorbed into the ethos of better health. I would say Finsbury Health Centre is the most complete expression of the ideals of modern architecture of its time. It had the three key messages: a very progressive social program, the use of new technology, advanced building techniques as they were then, and a very powerful, I think, aesthetic statement.
When Finsbury Health Centre opened in October 1938, hundreds of GPs and dignitaries were invited to see for themselves how radical modernist thinking had reinvented healthcare in Finsbury. Among these guests were representatives of many other local authorities. The movement they had resisted throughout the 1930s had proved it could solve some of their biggest problems. The establishment could no longer deny that modernism was the way forward. But in Europe, the powers that had forced so many émigré architects to flee to Britain had their own far less benevolent vision of the future. Less than a year after the centre opened, Britain declared war on Germany. The modernist plans for a brave new world would have to wait.
Aliens.
I think that's partly to do with Englishness, not xenophobia, but this reticence to have other people come in. But I think it's also partly to do with trying to keep away modernism, which I think was seen as a sort of left-wing socialist enemy almost coming into the country.
Nothing was too good for the ordinary person.
And that's at the root of modernism. This idea that this building is a socialist or social, perhaps, building, that it's for everybody.
The new pavilion was a real people's palace. It boasted a theatre for 1,500, a light and spacious restaurant,
Department stores, private houses, but most of his clients were Jewish. He was Jewish. And in January 1933, Hitler came to power, and he was advised, apparently by Chimaev, who wrote to him, he was advised to leave Germany. And he, I believe from his daughter, they just packed a bag and went.
Many of the residents of Bexhill gawped and complained as the strange steel skeleton appeared. Mendelssohn had used this technology before, but to the British, it was completely new.
Other architects were incredibly upset that the pair had won. In letters to the Architects' Journal that would be regarded as racist today, they attacked the design by what they called these
of the world's major cities and produced the Athens Charter, an idealistic blueprint for a new form of city. Among the architects on board was Wells Coates, a British-based Canadian. He was a founder member of the British wing of SIAM, and spurred on by the steady stream of émigré architects fleeing the Nazis, he helped the modernist movement in this country take shape. Just 1 year later, in 1934, Wells Coates completed the first project for communal modernist living in Britain. Built in the London suburb of Hampstead, the Lawn Road flats were commissioned by a design firm called Isokon. Isokon's owners, Jack and Molly Pritchard, were fascinated by modernist ideas. A library and reading rooms surrounded by elegant terraces and balconies.
Mendelssohn and Chimaev produced the first major welded steel frame building in Britain. The steel frame is exactly as it was, high above the auditorium. De La Ware wanted a building of the modern movement, and that is what he got. Did Mendelssohn put a lot of thought into how the services were going to be delivered?
I think he did, yes. And you can see that when you look at the building. These supporting columns here actually have the drain pipes running through, so that when you look at the building, there's no clutter on the outside of the building. There's no guttering, no downpipes that you can see. And that's true of the whole building inside and out. Everything is pure forms, light coming in, windows, thin membrane, like a skin, like a membrane around this steel frame.
By the 1930s, SIAM's membership had doubled, but Europe was in turmoil. The Nazis reviled the modern movement as a force for internationalism and communism. In 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor, CM convened on a boat in the Mediterranean to plan the future. Led by Corbusier, they studied plans of 34